Okay, question and answer.
Okay. My first question had to do with the effects of statistical error on your trends and possible overlapping error bars, as well as the deviation from a zero trend or slope.
Yes, I don't think we actually estimated the error terms. So our GPI trending upward is quite close to the GDP. So there might be, of course, errors involved in estimation, but we haven't actually calculated the
Part of the reason for that is that there aren't error bars available for all of the underlying data sources that we're relying on. So we've sort of taken them at being the best available. But we don't have error bar calculations. We have done some sensitivity analyses where looked at how things change with different methodologies. And that was all part of our discussions with the technical committee to arrive at what we think is the best methodology we have right now. But I think adding uncertainty calculations and error bars would be a great addition to the study in the future.
Another question?
One thing I just want to curious, do we have any projection on how frequently the trend will be updated for GPI? Because one of the concerns we have is biosecurity with respect to all of the natural resources we're dependent upon, agriculture, environmental, forest, or whatever provides the benefit for the quality of life that we have.
Well, we really, like I said before, we really see this as a starting point. We hope that it's something that's updated. As of right now, there are no plans to update it at any given time in the future. That sort of depends on who becomes interested in the study and who might want to pick it up. We really would hope that the state of Utah would do that and do it on an annual basis. That's what the state of Maryland does. They calculate this. Once you have your methods kind of plugged in and you just put in your new data every year, you can calculate things. In terms of the biosecurity question, I think it's a great point. It's something that people are starting to talk a little bit more about in the ecological economics field. In fact, I know the Bureau of Land Management and USGS has recently sort of taken on an ecosystem services valuation interest and sort of opened an office to sort of explore how to do that valuation appropriately and how to inform other federal agencies of their findings.
In 2012, the Salt Lake Valley Health Department is planning for a rehearsal for a magnitude 6 earthquake. Have you folded in that sort of risk into your analysis?
No. No. So any sort of wild card, projections. This is really looking backwards at what have we seen. So yes, that is a huge risk to our well-being. And there are other risks. The one that we may have captured would be the costs associated with climate change. So what do we anticipate our costs in terms of adaptation might be in the future? That one's captured. But other sorts of natural disasters are not captured as of yet. If they were to happen, they would certainly show up in future studies.
On that chart, the personal consumption is so huge that I think it makes it seem like that's more important than anything else.
That's true, and that's one of the major critiques of GPI that we take as our starting point, that personal consumption is good. We do see it as a proxy for material welfare, and we deducted, maybe speak to this better, we deducted some of the negative aspects of personal consumption. But there are a lot of positives that are wrapped into that metric.
We made a deduction for some types of food consumption. So we deducted 20% of food consumption as junk food and therefore detrimental. We deducted the half of alcohol consumption as detrimental to health, and all of tobacco consumption as detrimental to health. And those assumptions come from the Australia GPI study, where they actually kind of did an advanced deduction deduction from the personal consumption of these consumption items. And the alternative, of course, is to deduct the healthcare expenditures that are associated with the illnesses that would be associated with, diabetes and obesity and lung disease of various sorts and so forth, because that kind of after the consumption has taken place, kind of a deduction. And if I recall correctly, we did it ahead of time, deducted from personal consumption, and that amounted to about 3 to 4% of personal consumption. So it is not a major deduction, but some deduction, but we still have a huge bar there, personal
And
consumption
then there's
bar.
also the income inequality is deducted, pre-deducted inside that bar. You want to talk about that?
Right, so, yes, so we have the personal consumption is also adjusted for income distribution. In our case, of course, invariably in many countries and states, inequality is the characteristic feature rather than quality. So we actually, in order to not sort of create a misleading impression of, average personal consumption, everybody is sharing the same equal standard of living, you have to kind of factor in the cost of income inequality. And so that bar actually would have been even higher, because of greater magnitude if we hadn't deducted that for the state of Utah. But our state has, among its many unique features, the lowest level of inequality in the country when measured by Census Bureau's income surveys. But we also are aware of alternative measures of income inequality that are recently being phased in. And so we did a kind of a sensitivity analysis of the sort that Erica was mentioning. So we used two different methodologies. And once we used the new methodology, we actually find this bar kind of really shrinks in size by the magnitude of increasing inequality in the state. And the specifics of that methodology is that it uses tax returns data for all tax filing residents, whereas the U.S. Census Bureau data is a sample of some households, and it caps their income level at a certain level. So you don't get the high income folks represented. And so, but once you use the tax returns data to estimate the income inequality, you get the entire range of income. And so very high incomes are captured, and so you can see then high levels of inequality in the state as well. But we didn't use this methodology because it would sort of be we would be like one of the first in the country to use this in GPI studies, and it would have been a sort of a major, I guess, focal point of our study and kind of a magnet where people say, wait a minute, we have the lowest inequality in the state, and you're saying, inequality costs this much. But so I think we envision, future GPI studies using such, new methodology so that we get a kind of move towards a more realistic assessment of inequality and the cost of inequality in the country.
A further question.
Yeah.
Getting back to ecology. Is there a way to incorporate into GPI increased ecosystem protection or restoration of ecosystems? I'm thinking especially of, for instance, reintroducing wolves or keystone species or predators into a given ecosystem.
So the scale or the resolution, if you will, of this study is really at the acreage level. So what is the acreage of forests, deserts, and wetlands? So we'll pick up differences in losses and total acreage of those various ecosystems. But in terms of their quality, those are sort of averaged out in the way that this study is done for GPI. And the value data that we used was a study really relatively recently that actually was based on a restoration study where they looked at the difference in values of a restored acre versus a protected acre for various ecosystems in the West. And we just picked out the value of the total, the average average value of total acres for this study. But the ecosystem services valuation literature is large and growing. And so I think that those kinds of questions can be asked and actually can be now evaluated using ecosystem service valuation methodologies. But the resolution for our study didn't really get down to the species level. It was really more at sort of the aggregate acreage in the state. So we'll pick up, when we lose forests to development or if we lose wetlands to development, we pick up those losses and changes. But we don't pick up, quality of ecosystems so much.
But I think I've read sort of a report recently where in Canada they're trying to establish a species value for the polar bear, and I think it's sort of a roundabout way of sort of assessing value to the habitat of the polar bear. So it is in a way something that could be incorporated into an ecosystem service type of value.
There's certainly literature on specific species and their values. That's just not quite the angle that we have here for the whole state.
The state of Utah does have a wildlife action plan that in fact identifies, I think, 4 or 5 of the species, 4 or 5 of the top habitat areas in need of conservation for wildlife species. And there's a report that's online that has description of those habitat types, and grasslands is one, and shrublands is another, forests is another, as well as wetlands. So it matches the ones that you've done some ecosystem evaluation for. And it also, at the same time, identifies those species that are identified as being of greatest conservation need in the state that are associated with each of those habitat types. So actually there's an indirect linkage that could be shown that if this habitat type is affected and the value goes down over time or the value goes up over time, that there could conceivably not necessarily be a causal relationship, but at least some kind of a relationship. And that would be very interesting to look at with respect to, for example, did you look at large habitat types like the Great Salt Lake, which is a unique habitat type to the country, but definitely a large one here in this state, and the value that it would bring for a variety of services like brine shrimp, for aquaculture purposes, as far as feed for aquariums, or potentially for other recreational benefits, waterfowl, estuarine areas, that kind of thing.
So to answer your last part of your question first, for the Great Salt Lake, we don't have a separate category for Great Salt Lake. However, many of the aspects of the Great Salt Lake in terms of its economic value to the state are captured. Anything associated with aquaculture, the brine shrimp industry, the mineral extraction industry would show up effectively in personal consumption. So all of those people that are working, personal consumption is tied to income. So any sort of traditional economic activity is captured in this very large red bar on the graph. We do have the value of wetlands, and the value per acre of wetlands in our study, which was based on this study I mentioned that's specific to the Western United States, is actually very high in terms of per acre, and that's in part because wetlands are scarce. Now, most of the wetlands in Utah are around the Great Salt Lake or Utah Lake, so those values are definitely captured, and we have embedded in those numbers recreation values, biodiversity values, water filtration, flood protection, all of those sorts of aspects of ecosystem services associated with wetlands are captured. That said, I know the Great Salt Lake Council is right now looking at a study of the total economic value, market and non-market, of the Great Salt Lake, and I think that study is meant to be completed in early January 2012. So that could really inform, future updates to GPI.
Well, I certainly hope that they look at the non-market valuation with respect to wildlife recreation associated benefits of hunting, fishing, and wildlife viewing. One of the things that always puzzles me about the economic valuation of, for example, mineral extraction, Kennecott with copper, but selenium runoff into the Great Salt Lake, and what that effect is on the valuation of the benefit thereof, and if it Kennecott expands its area as it's proposing to do or petition to do, what would the potential reflection of the GPI be with respect to added selenium?
And I'm not sure that even future GPIs would pick up those sorts of changes. But I do think that this type of study, an ecosystem services valuation, can answer those sorts of questions on a more detailed scale. To get back to the first part of your question, I think this is a good example of how a state agency like the Division of Wildlife could provide more resolution, maybe pick out those hot spots in the state, use the average, they'd be most well positioned to take an average literature value in terms of ecosystem services and make adjustments for quality of ecosystems or hotspots in terms of conservation priorities. So I think that could all be wrapped in. It's just not part of the national level methods, and our resolution right now doesn't quite capture that. But this question, for example, of selenium, I think part of the trouble is that we always end up comparing apples and oranges. We've got an economic benefit to somebody on one side and then some sort of cost that's measured in different units. And so the more that we can measure things in similar units, the easier it is to see.
Exactly. And the value of this study I see is that we can make those decisions about trade-offs with more informed policymakers that can then justify what the true benefit is for the populace, as well as the long-term health for not only the ecosystem but the human population as well.
I mean, we really see the adoption of this full accounting framework in all of the states' decision-making and planning processes as the most important sort of contribution of this study. I mean, GPI is rather crude in the end. It doesn't capture this kind of, selenium runoff or, other kinds of detail level concerns. But if the framework is adopted, then, as Erica pointed out, it could be sort of really, the resolution could really be increased, and it would then, we would not have this sort of lack of attention to these important issues. At the moment, we're just sort of, I sort of want to point out this analogy. I mean, you wouldn't, if you were a business owner, you wouldn't run your business on just looking at the revenue side of your business, your sales only, without regard for, what your expenditures are, what your depreciation costs are. But that's what we're doing in the state as well as, nationally, when we're sort of looking at the GDP only to say, oh, we're doing great, and, not sort of looking at the debit side is a huge, huge flaw. And so I think if we can kind of move towards adopting a sort of a full accounting framework, with or without the GPI as an additional indicator, in addition to GDP, we're kind of will be in a good place.
Just a quick question. Has the Utah legislative or House of Representatives and our senators, have they been exposed to any of this information?
We presented to the Quality Growth Commission with the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, and actually had a pretty good reception. They were definitely interested. It was in the middle of the session, so they wanted us to come back and talk to them in a little bit better time for them, and we're still looking to do that in the next few months.
But also, I think it'd be good to mention that there is a one-page summary which has been mailed out to legislators, excuse me, as well as the executive summary.
Right.
So to the extent that they read them.
There's been an effort.
There's been definitely an effort.
One of my concerns with information like this is the fact that so many people are leaving the state of Utah for health reasons.
The air quality.
The gentleman that runs the Wild Bird store in Holiday is trying to sell it so that he can move to another part of the country for a PM from the 2.5 isn't so great. So,
Well, I mean, our estimates of the air pollution does not, of course, factor in, the loss of businesses or people, companies that don't locate in Salt Lake because of PM 2.5 or just general air pollution problems. And so we have really a conservative estimate here on the cost of air pollution.
Just primarily health costs, health damage costs. But it's definitely conservative. It is based on a county level analysis done by some researchers at Yale University. They did for the entire country. So they got down to the county level. What is the cost per ton emitted of most of the criteria pollutants? So we've got the damage piece, but as Gunseli said, we certainly don't have the economic development costs or losses associated with poor air quality in Utah. And it's of great concern to a lot of us. I'm a mother, and it's something I worry about a lot.
Rio Tinto has just recently got permission to pollute.
And as it is, we're not meeting the EPA's ambient air quality standards, so we're not in a good place with that decision.
On that, do you think that the GPI study is adequate enough or states well enough the impact of air quality and particulate matter and such things that we deal with day to day, especially in the winter here?
I think it's a great start. It's certainly a conservative estimate. I talked with the researchers that did the damage study at the county level, and they said, I asked them if they were able to capture the damages associated with inversions, which is something that's sort of unique to the Intermountain West. And they did run a climate model as part of their study, but they acknowledged that they may not have captured all of the increased damages associated with our unique sort of topography. So if anything, for several reasons, we think our estimates are conservative. But nonetheless, over $400 million a year is nothing to ignore, and still something to pay attention to. I know there are some other estimates out there associated with the damages, just associated, for example, with coal-fired power plants. So there's other studies out there. But I do think it'd be great if another great example, if the state's Division of Air Quality were able to adopt some sort of damage costs in their own studies as they look at approving or denying permits for people. If they had, again, that sort of unit that we can all understand and look at. Now, there's obviously some problems with putting everything in dollar values because we're talking about actual people and their actual health. But it does serve to really communicate what the magnitude of those damages are at the sort of society level.
Just a question when you brought up the intangibles, the non-measurables, the sort of overlooked invisible things in the qualitative side of things. I know that in the initial part of your presentation, you said you'd speak more to that. Are there preferred kind of qualitative measures that people can link with the GPI that would be beneficial for us to not only use a unit of measure in economic terms, but a consistent qualitative evaluative tool?
I think the subjective well-being.
The Envision Utah study is the only one that's so far available that complements well the results of the study. Then, I don't know if there are any studies, happiness index for the state.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's several different metrics and methods out there,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the more of them we can apply to Utah, and the clearer our picture will become of true quality of life for Utahns.
I'm wondering, when you were talking about the inversions, if any of your counties are outside of the Wasatch Front, and if you have a slide that shows the different, how your study is, your county measurements over those different years?
We actually have in our spreadsheet, I don't have a slide today, air quality costs at the county level, but that is actually I think it's the only, maybe not, it's one of the only components that we actually did calculate for every single county in Utah, and then we aggregated it at the state level. And we present it in our report for the 6 counties that we looked at, which are those along the Wasatch Front, so Utah, Salt Lake, and Davis, and Weber, and then also Cache County and Washington County in southern Utah. But we do, if you get into our spreadsheet and then you're interested, I'd be happy to provide you with those total costs. They obviously are much higher in populated areas where we experience inversions, which are where most people live in Utah.
A question that I was just thinking about now. Is there any way in your model to correct for immigration versus immigration, such as people leaving the state or entering the state for economic reasons?
No, it shows up in population, so it shows up when we try to express per capita GPI or per capita costs or per capita values. So it's in the denominator.
Yeah.
And,
But a reason for population growth or decline doesn't show up.
So for instance, I left the state because I couldn't make a living in this state as a teacher.
Right.
So I left for another state, so I wondered if that was included at all.
No, that won't.
I don't know that necessarily there would be any way of putting it into the GPI, but this whole discussion about immigrants and those of us that come from a different country, some of us are here legally, some of us may not be, and whether or not that has an impact on the GPI and what services might be provided by labor that is unfortunately underpaid and probably should be paid better, and also the loss of positive value for the state by having to spend so much money on trying to figure out whether or not we should allow these people to stay that may not be here totally legally.
Well, I mean, all of this unfortunately is captured by personal consumption, so illegal or legal immigrants will be earning a living and spending in the state, so that personal consumption is picking up as a positive to the extent our labor force is growing.
Though the underemployment, unemployment would pick up some of what you're after, so.
Right, so if, you know,
It's not separated out, right?
It's not separated.
It's in there.
It's in there. So if underemployment, for example, is caused by, let's say, kind of a creation of a more low-wage workforce through, you know, undocumented workers, I mean, that cost we are picking up. But we don't know the causal, as Jeff pointed out, causal mechanisms of rising underemployment.
And this brings up two, I think, really important points, which is one, that this is not the only indicator, and we're not suggesting that this should replace other things that the state's currently using, because it doesn't capture everything. So I think that's something just to keep in mind. And then the other thing is, no matter where we've done this presentation, it's spawned a lot of questions about each of the individual components, which I think is a great thing. And when we see some of these trends about underemployment or ecosystem services, if that gets people thinking about doing a more detailed and in-depth study about that particular component to try and tease out some of these causal factors and relationships, I think that's a net win for everybody to better understand really what's going on in our state.
But I mean, interestingly, since the undocumented immigration has picked up in the state in the last decade, you kind of see some of these I mean, typical indicators that people who are concerned about immigration point out, crime and so forth, you know, family breakdown. I mean, those are actually trending downward. And so, you know, in some ways, those costs are not picked up in terms of social cohesion indicators in the GPI.
And there's one other really important piece of society that's not captured in GPI, and that's government services expenditures. And there's a long discussion about why that is, and we went into it a little bit in our report. And it's something that could be revisited in future GPIs. But in general, government expenditures and taxation is not something that's captured by GPI. And actually, when you start going down that road, it gets very complicated when you're trying to compare yourselves to other states that may have higher tax rates but more services, and how do you balance all of that out to be reasonable. So it's not really captured.
So that's another example of a complementary measure system, evaluation system that would be recommended as an additive for more complementary.
So social services, a lot of the healthcare expenditures that people had asked about would show up in some of those government.
So is that a social cohesion measure, or is that a Is that more in the other area?
It's kind of in all, I mean, I think it crosses the
Crosses.
economic, social, and environmental. There's expenditures and services provided for all of those.
Well, I really think that the social cohesion measure, for example, would be any of those units that we use to compile that. Utah's got one of the highest volunteer rates.
Right. I was just gonna-
So that would be really a wonderful thing to highlight with respect to, if that's measured in the social.
It is,
It is.
that one is.
It
It
Yeah.
is. I mean, the government services, you know, actually, states or countries that have large government expenditures and high taxation rates do include in their GPI calculation public services, some public services. But we have sort of, I guess, been following the U.S. studies that have not included that. So, but it's definitely a next step.
There's, when you get into that, there's also a concern about double counting. So for example, some places or some GPI studies have counted the value of higher education. Though a lot of economists would say that higher education, a higher educated populace will show up as a higher personal income and therefore higher personal consumption. So we wouldn't want to double count that value. So you'd want to pull out just the value of it that's separate from increased income.
Right.
And that gets a little bit messy.
And also there's a correlation between volunteer work and higher educated population, so positive correlation. So again, since we are including volunteer work, so we want to include the value of higher education. And definitely there's scope for improvement.